I know the program says Rob Fincham, but we did the research together with Charles Breen, and I'll be presenting today. And so we'll be talking about enhancing the performance of conservancies. And if you look at that photo, doesn't it look like a lovely place? And having learned about ecosystem services and the benefits over the past few days, one would imagine that such a place would offer benefits to the individual landowner and to the wider community. So our research set out to assess the role of conservancies in achieving this, because conservancies are understood as promoting the expansion of conservation areas as well as enhancing the securing of ecosystem benefits. So to start with, I'll look at the role of conservancies in the context of a landscape conservation approach. Then we'll highlight conservancies as common pool resources, and then we'll highlight a few expressed views of the role of conservancies from the Dargle Conservancy, and then we'll sort of make a proposition of how to enhance the performance of conservancies. So current views of conservancies sort of raise the critical role that community-based conservation areas play in terms of the benefits that ecosystem services provide to the wider community. So in South Africa, at the national and provincial levels, conservancies are understood as securing biodiversity conservation and ecosystem services in terms of the critical role they play in conservation beyond private property boundaries. And so they are understood as contiguous multiple private properties. And in this context, they are defined as a common pool resource. So that's at the national and provincial level in terms of the Biodiversity Stewardship Program. So in theory, at the Dargle Conservancy level, similar meanings are supposed to be sort of expressed at this level. So these include achieving landscape conservation, extending areas under conservation, securing ecosystem services and biodiversity conservation, and then also looking out for individual livelihoods in the context of these collective conservation objectives. And so from that map in the background, you can see the boundary of the Dargle Conservancy in the bold yellow, and then the multiple private properties that create this common pool resource at the Dargle Conservancy level. So conservancies provide various socio-ecological services and processes that traverse multiple property boundaries. And so this therefore creates this common pool resource through ecological networks and conservation corridors that are created. And then this common pool resource occurs within that defined geographic area of these multiple private properties. And in creating this common pool resource, conservancies also create a collective of people with shared meanings and intent, and they are expected to act collectively. And in acting collectively, this underlines the importance of conservancies as socio-ecological systems that go beyond these individual property boundaries. But in terms of the present realities that we found in the Dargle Conservancy, this was not so. What we found were strong views against external interference in land use and management, particularly towards Ezemvelo, hazard and wildlife. And this expressed the failure to recognize common property rights and the lack of appreciation for the role of the Conservancy outside protected areas. And so in effect, this has resulted in there being no collective management plans in the Dargle Conservancy at that landscape scale. So just a graph to show you some of the findings that we had, where landowners expressed an understanding of common pool resources, of some of the natural resources, but this was just at the small scale of the individual properties. So for example, indigenous forests were identified as a common pool resource, but in terms of landowners being able to control who has access to this forest and if they like them to come or not. So an example of that quote where someone says, "I do still feel this is my piece of forest, but I'm very happy to share that." So these strong views of private property rights have consequences in terms of achieving the landscape conservation approach. So in our view, the present reality is that conservancies, in relation to the Dargle Conservancy, they're not realizing the goal of managing common pool resource at this landscape scale. So how can we help conservancies to achieve this? We feel that the model or perception of private tenure conservancies needs to be reconceptualized. that is a mosaic of these individually owned properties must incorporate a vision of managing a shared resource. And in having that understanding of a shared resource, sharing must come with rights and responsibilities, which inculcate collective action through collective management for the common good. As Brent has shown us, vultures go all the way up to Central Africa. So even in the Doggo Conservancy context, it should be beyond the individual property boundaries. So some of the things that need to happen are having clearly defined boundaries in terms of the social and ecological systems of these multi-tenure regimes. There needs to be proportionate equivalence of benefits and costs. So the issue of incentives to the individual landowners, but also allowing for property actions to conform to the collective conservation at the landscape scale. And there needs to be collective choice arrangements where rules are shaped by the landowners, but also where they recognize associated property rights at the landscape scale in terms of access and use of the ecosystem services. And then there also has to be graduated sanctions, so where these rules guide land use to contribute to collective conservation at the landscape scale. And then the nested tiers of governance, where rights and responsibilities are integrating management of these common pool resources at the different scales. So, in this context, we feel that scales of stewardship are very important. So what happens at the local level must translate to the bigger, larger scales, provincial, national, and regional. And then has to be collective action through collective management. So an overall management plan at the conservancy scale related to the provincial and national objectives. And so although individual actions at the private property levels are important, these need to be in the context of sustaining functional socio-ecological systems at the Doggo Conservancy level and the wider provincial and national scales. And then most importantly for me is there needs to be shared meanings. As Brent said, there needs to be common interest. Okay, so the multiple roles of conservancies should be shared amongst individual landowners, which will eventually influence behavior for people to act for the greater common good. And so I'll leave you with the question of how can we achieve this, because we're still talking about how we can set up something that can work in the Doggo Conservancy. And so I'd like to thank institutions that have supported me in my research, Copperfield University, UKZN, MIDI, the University of Montana, and most especially the Doggo Conservancy community that allowed me to go into their homes and express their opinions about what they felt about the Conservancy. Thank you.